So I'm just going to kick us off here. I'd like to start by introducing John Tamny. He is the editor of Real Clear Markets, a senior fellow at the Market Institute, and a senior economic advisor to Applied Finance Advisors. Among his books is the bestseller When Politicians Panicked, The New Coronavirus, Expert Opinion, and a Tragic Lapse of Reason. Next, I'd like to introduce Phil Kerpen. Phil is the president of the American Commitment in the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. American Commitment is a 501c4 group dedicated to restoring and protecting America's core commitment to free markets, economic growth, constitutionally limited government, property rights, and individual freedom. Finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Marty Makary. Marty is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and author of 2 New York Times best-selling books. Dr. Makary also served in leadership at the World Health Organization and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. A public policy researcher, he leads a Johns Hopkins initiative on the redesign of healthcare to make healthcare more reliable, more appropriate, and more affordable, especially for vulnerable populations. He is the recipient of the 2020 Business Book of the Year Award for his book, The Price We Pay, about the high cost of healthcare and the grassroots movement to increase transparency. His newest book, Blind Spots, challenges conventional medical dogma to educate people about their health. And we also have Jennifer Grossman here serving as our moderator, and I will pass things off to you, Jag. Let's give them a warm welcome. Round of applause.
And I will mention Phil, previous guest on our podcast, John, previous guest on our podcast, Marty, future guest on our podcast. So fabulous. So earlier this year, I traveled to Australia, a country which implemented some of the harshest lockdowns and restrictions during COVID. And the general feeling I observed is that no one wanted to talk about it. Everybody just wanted to move on. And, you know, I think there's a little bit of that here as well, even in our movement, not with me, as anybody who watches the podcast knows. Is this a kind of blank out as opposed to an accounting of policy failures going to invite history to repeat itself?
Well, you know, I think that when you have literally billions of people participate in something that is mostly irrational, something that involves self-sacrifice. Psychologically, most of them will never admit that it wasn't effective or that it wasn't necessary, and therefore they'd rather just move on than account for what happened. And so I do think that there is some considerable risk of all of these same policy mistakes being repeated again in the future, especially because the institutional structure, the World Health Organization and so forth, have not only not acknowledged error, but they've learned the wrong lessons. And they're saying, you know, we need to lock down faster and harder and more comprehensively next time there's a health threat. And so I am concerned that we've not learned these lessons. And I recently put out a pretty comprehensive study with Scott Atlas and Steve Hanke and Casey Mulligan that people can get at committeetounleashprosperity.com that runs through what we think the real lessons learned should be. And we're distributing that everywhere because I greatly fear that the only people who still care about COVID, by and large, are the people who got it all wrong. And they're still in positions of power.
By the way, speaking of Committee to Unleash Prosperity, who in the room is subscribed to the hotline? One person, okay.
Well, you should sign up for that. It's, you know, it's interesting. We started, this is the daily newsletter. It goes out under Steve Moore's name. I do the first draft, and then he rewrites it, and John Fund and Peter Roth and others contribute items. So we do it every weekday, and it's totally free. You can get it on committeetounleashprosperity.com, but we started it, we were going to do it like daily for the lockdowns for like the 2 weeks of the, and we're still doing it 4 years later. But we cover a lot, you know, beyond COVID now. It's basically, you know, economic issues and so forth. But that's how it started, and then it just never ended.
And I highly, highly recommend it. It is definitely a must read for me, and hope you guys don't mind seeing all of the charts that you put in there showing up in Atlas Society memes on a daily, if not weekly basis. So. Anybody else want to take a crack at that question?
Well, yeah, I'd like to jump in There's a book about it called When Politicians Panic that all of you should buy several copies of. But it is important. We do have to keep talking about this, because if we don't, history will say that a virus caused a global economic crack-up that caused hundreds of millions around the world to rush towards starvation, hundreds of millions more back to poverty, not to mention what happened here. So it's got to be discussed. But I hope it's discussed in the right way. It cannot be stressed enough that easily the worst arguments for and against the lockdowns, and this is not a knock on the doctor, are and were medical. Why would you give your freedom up? The worst arguments for the lockdowns were the initial ones. Well, if we let people remain free and go to their jobs and live their lives, they'll get sick and the hospitals aren't ready for it. Have you ever been so insulted in your life? What you need to have your hand held to avoid something that might make you sick? And then they doubled down on the insult. They said, well, there's a study from London saying that if we don't take away people's freedom and put them out of work and everything, that millions, I think what was the number, 2.1 million Americans will die. Well, what if they had said 50 million? The higher the number, the more absurd the lockdown is. Who in this room needs to be forced to avoid doing something that might kill them? In which case some will say, well, yeah, but see, we know better. But never forget, the people are the market. And so what people do is essential. It's got to be everyone. Freedom is most important when we're in the biggest trouble. And this is where the right really needs to pay for what happened here. It's easy to be for free markets and freedom when everything's tranquil. But when we need Republicans in particular to actually act like Republicans is when things aren't tranquil. And so with this right now, it's got to be that you needed people to be making different decisions freely so we could know the answers. How lethal is it? How non-lethal is it? Instead, we blinded ourselves and gave away our freedom in the process. Never do it again, and never let people change the subject. They stole our freedom as a way of mitigating a virus. Have you ever heard something so ludicrous in your life? And so let's talk about it over and over again to make sure that they can't do this again.
Marty, I got this question for, definitely. As the doctor on the panel and someone actually who trained under my father, who's a cardiologist, how do we take the politics out of pandemic policy, out of medical decisions? They seem to manage it in Sweden, where a more actually liberal left government implemented a more level-headed, more objectively, scientifically based policy with regard to COVID. Is there any hope that other countries will adopt a more rational approach rather than a panicked one going forward?
Right now, first of all, thanks for having me. Nice to see everybody. The situation is getting worse in science. There is a partisan divide in science where if you don't agree with an establishment agenda that has a certain narrative, then you're censored, silenced, downplayed, downregulated, left out of the meetings. And we saw that play out during COVID. There was the New England Journal of Medicine, our top journal in medicine, used to be our top journal, departed from its 208-year tradition of not endorsing politicians and endorsed Joe Biden for president. And there was this rage in the scientific leadership that, looking back on it, the absurdity of the rage was around if Trump would only wear a cloth mask, we could finally control this thing. And there's a doctor named Peter Marks at the FDA, about 12 miles from here, who got the results of the phase 3 clinical trial on the vaccine about a week or so before the election and decided to bury those results until election day or waited a few days. Didn't matter, people died. Didn't matter if tens of thousands of people died. Which is what we believed at the time. It's better not to get them in. So this Trump derangement syndrome is dominant. And I can't believe this isn't a bigger topic in the election, personally. Seeing people, I don't know if they're just burnt out. I mean, you may know better than I. but to think about these persistent errors. It's not just in an emergency scrambling and making a call and you made the wrong call. No, it's persistently for almost 2 years insisting the schools shuts the kids out, that toddlers wear masks, ignoring natural immunity, pushing boosters on young, healthy people, prohibiting family members from visiting their loved ones in the hospital for almost 2 years. I mean, that's a human rights violation. And yet now when public health officials are asked, they're like, yeah, we did our best, or other people say, give them a break. We're like, excuse me? This is the biggest public health intervention in history. You have no interest in studying the effectiveness of the interventions. And the entire nightmare of COVID for 3 years, 20 million people dead, was avoidable had a bunch of scientists not been messing around with a virus in a laboratory. The virus, the entire pandemic, came from the scientific community. It was spawned, it was born within scientific research. And there's no interest in now guarding the scientific community from that happening again.
If I could just add to the point about the schools and Trump derangement, a lot of people forget, but the 2020-21 school year was on track to be a pretty normal school year in midsummer. In late June, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out very good guidance, said all the schools should be open, the kids need to be in them. If you can't do 6 feet, do less than that. It's better than them sitting at home. Don't worry about masks with younger kids in particular, elementary age. They probably can't get benefit from them anyway. And when that came out, I thought, oh, we're going to have a normal school year. This is amazing. The pediatricians are doing the right thing. And you know, they put that out. They were invited to the White House. Trump said, look, the pediatricians say the school should be open. And then there was all sorts of back-channel traffic between the pediatricians and the unions. And this is terrible. Trump is using you. And a few days later, they flipped 180 degrees, and they put out new guidance jointly between the American Academy of Pediatrics and the two major teachers unions, and they said, we still want schools open, of course, unless there's a lot of COVID around, then they should be closed. Yeah. And of course, everyone knew there was a lot of COVID around. As soon as Trump said it, it was a
reversal.
Can we, to some degree, though, acknowledge that Trump was his own? If Trump doesn't panic, there are no lockdowns. I mean, when I go on TV sometimes, they're blaming Biden for the lockdowns. Trump signed a $3 trillion CARES Act that if he had said, I'm staying out of this, and there's no federal response to this, there are no lockdowns. California maybe lasts a week, New York maybe a week, and Texas and Florida never do it. Trump signed the bill with a bunch of panicky Republicans, without which there's no way the lockdowns could have happened because there wasn't the money to prop people up at home watching Netflix and ordering food off of Grubhub from the untouchables that delivered it to them. So there's reasons to be deranged about Trump because it's so easy, once again, to be Republican when times are good. But every time we expect them to actually act like Republicans, think 2008, think 2020, they invariably become a bunch of whiny people and say, oh no, let's lock people down, let's take away their freedom. We saw it with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, we saw it with all the happy talkers, and we saw it right up to the president. And so there's a reason to be angry at them, because if Trump doesn't do what he does, we're having an entirely different discussion right now.
even some libertarian institutions.
Without question, the fact, if anyone from Cato's here, Cato completely sat that out, so did Cato supported it to varying degrees. What libertarians did in this instance was inexcusable. As our friend Jeffrey Tucker said, the libertarian groups have become basically a major fundraising operation, nothing else. They don't do anything when it actually matters, and they certainly did nothing here.
And sadly, even some objectivist organizations got this issue wrong and took bailout money when the Atlas Society most certainly didn't, and has been consistent from day one on these issues. So on the issue of lockdowns, over the past years, we've seen a lot of media misinformation on a whole host of issues related to COVID and the policy interventions implemented, supposedly to limit the spread. On one issue, at least, the impact of school closures on learning loss and mental health, there appears to be some willingness in the media to come to terms with the reality of the harms of that policy. What about other issues, the efficacy of masks or lockdowns in general. Have you seen any willingness to re-examine the so-called consensus, either in the medical journals or in the media more broadly?
There's a new mask study this week in BMJ. It's a randomized controlled trial, one of the Scandinavian countries. And they headlined it as another one of these studies, oh, masks work, now we proved it. And then you look in the study and, first of all, there was no impact on COVID. The impact was on self-reported respiratory symptoms. And they actually have a table in there that breaks out people who believed that masks would work versus people who didn't. And only the people who thought, they only worked if you thought they worked. It was the magical power of belief. If you believed that they would work, then you reported less respiratory symptoms. But this has generated another round of headlines. This time we've got it, they really work. I don't know, it's very hard to prove a null. And you can have a dozen or 24 studies that basically say null hypothesis, and then you can cook them and torture the data all day, like the Bangladesh study, and try to find some small effect, and then everyone will go nuts, hey, we were right after all, and they're still doing it as of this week. So, I think that most people know that if masks do anything, it's a tiny effect size, and definitely not worth mandates and disrupting society over. But the medical scientific establishment is still trying to find that. They're still trying to deny that, I think. I don't. What do you think, Marty?
So we're in a very scary time where if a study shows what you want it to believe, then it's heralded as great scientific evidence. And if it shows what you don't like, then you ignore it or find some way to criticize it. And that's scary. It's happening with the transgender issue right now in America. And COVID was a snapshot into the hubris of the medical establishment. It wasn't like, medicine got one thing wrong. We got opioids wrong for 35 years, igniting an epidemic. We got peanut allergies wrong for 17 years, creating the modern-day peanut allergy epidemic, which doesn't exist in other countries. We got the low-fat diet wrong for 70 years. We separated babies at birth from their mothers for 50 years incorrectly. We got so many massive health recommendations wrong, arguably the biggest, and in part that's the idea of the book Blind Spots, is to show how smart people can develop humongous blind spots unless you promote the civil discourse that I think embodies what the Atlas Society is all about.
Well, just one thing, I think the mask studies that Phil talks about speak to the problem of making this a medical debate. Once you make it about studies proving your argument, you've shifted the debate to the terms of the other side that wants to lock you down. Let's repeat it again, that the people are the marketplace. And that's not some slogan to get everyone all riled up here. That's just a truth. If masks work or if they don't, let people in the marketplace decide that. And if a bunch of COVID deniers, like some of us in this room, are falling over, dying, or getting really sick from not wearing masks, there's your signal. And there's the educated signal that actually people can use on the way to a better way of handling the virus. The challenge of what we did back in 2020 is that in taking away freedom, we blinded everyone to the truth about the virus one way or the other. And most notably, we did it with businesses. Disney, and this is not a knock on Disney, Disney has access to the capital markets. They understandably might have shut down for a bit just to figure things out because they had brand risk. But small businesses logically don't have that kind of access. And so you let them, you basically decree freedom, at which point the small businesses figure out a way to serve customers who are potentially scared, who've been lied to and by people who overreacted. And then that teaches the big businesses how to reopen. Instead, we just blinded everyone.
Or we did the opposite in a lot of places and shut down small businesses and made exemptions for big box stores and places that had the lobbying access and the clout to get carved out of the lockdown orders.
Just on a side note about the studies that get picked up if they confirm the narrative or they say what is politically preferable versus the others. Sonia, earlier today you had mentioned this study about universal basic income getting all of the press, right? The one that
The NVR one that just came out?
No, and I read from the hotline this morning your reporting on the BIR one because that actually has a different result. So, Dr. Makary, the Supreme Court recently sided with the Biden administration, saying it's fine for the White House to request that certain voices be constrained on social media. What do you think of that decision overall? Why is freedom of expression in medicine and science so important when it comes to dissenting voices?
Well, scientific discovery has always come from smart people challenging deeply held assumptions that were widely believed in the field. From the discovery of the fact that the heart pumps blood around the body, they used to think the blood just sat and didn't move, and food would convert into blood. And somebody challenged it. Now, he was burned at the stake, but then a guy about 30 years afterwards, Michael Servetus, ran with that idea. And almost every major discovery has that story. So civil discourse is at the root of scientific discovery. Science is about different ideas and wrestling with those ideas. The Supreme Court case, and my friends were the plaintiffs in that case, suing the Biden administration over censorship because the Biden administration, Surgeon General, and a whole bunch of folks sent emails saying, take this down, take that down. Well, the Supreme Court made a really tragic ruling, I think, by saying, no, the Biden administration didn't do anything wrong, but they really threw it out because they say First Amendment didn't apply because they didn't censor an individual. They said, take anything down related to natural immunity, which is kind of a crazy argument. So they're going to go back, I think, and try to relitigate the case. But my research team and I published the biggest study on natural immunity. If you're watching Fox News or some of the outlets, you saw me on there pounding away at Dr. Fauci every single day of the pandemic. We had some disagreements. And we did ultimately, my feeling was he could have settled any COVID controversy within 2 weeks by commissioning a massive study with his giant billion-dollar budget. But he didn't do that. Instead, he pondered and pontificated. It might be this, might be that. This is what I think. Just ruling by opinion. He could have done a definitive trial on masks, on the vaccine and babies. And all these controversies could have been answered immediately by Dr. Fauci if he would have allocated his resources at NIH to do it. He chose not to.
They actually announced an NIH hydroxychloroquine trial, and then they canceled it, saying they couldn't find enough people to sign up, which I always found unbelievable.
Typical.
And just how could they have had trouble finding people?
Typical. Well, my biggest thing was people that recovered from COVID are immune. We've known that for any infection. When you recover, you've got immunity. People always ask me, how did you discover natural immunity? It was the Athenian plague of 430 BC when they noticed people didn't get reinfected and sick. And so almost a year and a half into it, we're like, well, what the heck? These people in New York, they got infected a year and a half ago. Has anyone gotten reinfected and intubated or sick in the ICU? And why is nobody providing this data? So we did the study. We got hundreds of people, drew their blood, measured their antibody levels, and it turns out natural immunity was persistent, strong, and protective for the up to 2-year period that we studied. We were 2 years into it at that point. Well, we published the study in our biggest scientific journal, Journal of the American Medical Association. And here's a Johns Hopkins study with top authors from the National Academy of Medicine, many authors in the top medical journal, and social media took it down. If you posted it, they took it down because it could create vaccine hesitancy. And so behind a lot of this stuff, when I would talk privately with public health officials, the officials you saw on TV, and I'd say, what the hell? You guys know natural immunity is effective. They would say, well, Marty, the public cannot understand nuance. We have to make the message simple and clean. In other words, they truly believe the public is too stupid to understand any nuance, so we have to talk down to them and even lie. And I think the lying has caught up with them, and people don't trust them anymore.
I really like the bill that Jim Jordan and James Comer passed out of the House last year, which Schumer refuses to take up in the Senate, that just says if you're a government employee and you direct any private entity to censor speech or violate anyone's First Amendment rights, you can get fired and fined up to $50,000. I mean, I think if you don't have accountability at the level of individual government employees, even if you got a favorable court decision, how would that have an impact on the actual behavior of these government bureaucrats? And so I really like that bill that passed the House last year, and I would hope we can get a little bit of pressure on the Senate to act on it, because it's pretty hard to defend allowing government employees to do that.
I like that. And by the way, the biggest spreader of misinformation during the pandemic was the United States government.
John, I want to circle back to your book, When Politicians Panicked. You focused on the economic impact of various COVID policy interventions, including economic interventions like the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, which for, again, the Record Atlas Society unequivocally rejected taking. You can clap for that. Other than waste and fraud, what was the economic impact of the PPP, these government loans?
Well, I think whenever you get into the waste and fraud, you're stepping on the real story.
Yeah.
And our side does this all the time, that they see that one ridiculous instance of government spending to say, see. No, the problem is the government spending. The problem is the extraction of the wealth. And in this case, the PPP was the ultimate non sequitur. Look at what the economy was doing. Look at the stock market before March of 2020. These companies were fine, then they weren't. And so to basically institute the PPP is like looking at a broken leg and fixing a broken arm. You're avoiding the real problem. We had lockdowns, hence businesses were in trouble. To then do that, and this is the ultimate, what infuriates me, the lockdowns are so infuriating in so many ways, but I can't not do my job, and I'm getting to the point of this. And you think what they said to people, well, here's $1,200 for your trouble. Have you ever been more insulted than that we'll give you a little money, as though people just do work for money as opposed to developing their talents? Now think of this in terms of businesses. These people in many instances spent their lives building these businesses only to be told, oh, by the way, what we've done is so frightfully awful for the U.S. economy that there are no private capital markets. But guess what? You can now swallow your pride and take government money, which you might have to take because you've got a family, you've got other things to worry about, you've got employees potentially to worry about. And so they did the ultimate sick act. They drove businesses into the arms of government. And that's not that you guys didn't take it as beautiful, but I'm sorry, in some instances, businesses probably felt they had no choice. And the sick nature of this, but yes, it was an utter non sequitur. Businesses were fine. They by nature failed. That's called progress in a free society, something Republicans forget every time they actually need to remember this. And so we started bailing out, we started inserting, quote, government money into businesses, and just disastrous and insulting.
Yeah, I think the distinction is, if you have a movie theater and the government prevents you from operating your movie theater, but any think tank that is in the idea transaction business that can find other ways to continue to operate should definitely have zero excuse for taking government money, especially think tanks that are supposedly advocating liberty. So some say that the lockdowns were only a dress rehearsal for climate lockdowns. Do you think that's a possibility, or have we learned any lessons?
If you go on the World Economic Forum website right now, there's a page on there that says COVID was the, I don't remember the verbatim, but it's basically COVID was the test run for what we want to do on climate. I mean, they say that. So will they succeed? That I don't know. But are we drawing some conspiracy type connection? No. I mean, we have advocates of lockdown specifically saying, this idea of, social pressure and rolling out, these various coercive measures. This is the model. This is the model for climate. And so, and I think that if they succeed in that, it will be much worse in that, people kind of know when a viral epidemic's over. Okay, the virus is still around, but it's kind of a normal cold now. People aren't scared of it. They couldn't really continue these extraordinary measures even if they wanted to. But when something's based on predictions on 100 years in a computer, how do you ever get to the all clear sign? How does it ever actually end? So I think they want to. I think people are more skeptical of it than ever because of the experience in COVID, so I don't know if they'll succeed, but if they do, it has no logical endpoint, so it's even worse than what we just went through.
How should young people here today, our students, prepare for the next public health crisis, and what actions can they take not to have their civil liberties infringed?
I'll just say briefly, the untold story of COVID was its effect on poor and minority communities in the United States. For a lot of people in the laptop class, they just did their Zoom calls in their pajamas and life wasn't bad. They had their country clubs and their private tutors and their private schools were open. Come to inner city Baltimore, it was unrelenting. It was brutal. And I think we can be the champion for these health disparities, for these social disparities, in a way that speaks to the truth, because there is a sort of a ruling class that decides with their sort of top-heavy decision-making power what's best for everybody, and we've got the eyes on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be stressed enough what a disaster this was for those with the least around the world. Don't ever, if a politician ever tells me again that they're in it for the poor people, I mean, what a lie. But it is important with the young people around. This is another example of why you want freedom. Young people are your ultimate test group, precisely because they want to get to the bars and the parties and make out with everyone and do all the fun stuff. They were supposed to, in a normal free world, by living their lives, find out for the rest of us what was true and what wasn't true. And to some degree, I'm sure they did. Let's hope. God, I would have been texting everyone I knew if I'd been locked down to go have some fun. But the point is, let's hope they did. But when we needed people to try different things, you needed my parents in Southern California, old people, deniers of it. You needed them living their lives, which they did, to find out if it was going to kill you for living your life. You needed someone like me for whom a daily visit to the grocery store was the exciting part of my day. And not wearing masks was never. You needed to find out from deniers like me whether that was true or not. You needed to find out from people like my wife, who literally, if someone was walking by us on the street, she'd jump out off the curb, drove me nuts. You need to find out from her if her precautions made sense. Again, this marketplace at work, freedom at work. Instead, we shut it down. But young people are most crucial in this, is you need to find out from people's actions what makes sense. Instead, they chose one size fits all and blinded us.
To do some Q&A. All right, raise your hands. We'll get microphones over to you. We could start, Isabel, over here in the back.
Great presentation. I had a few questions, I guess, about the whole science thing. Obviously, science is great, but as I'm sure you guys know, it's been a problem for a while with books like science fictions or fashionable nonsense. You have research that's just clearly that, nonsense. So I guess, how do you think about putting rationality back into science and kind of pushing back on any of these papers or any of these ideas that are just fluffy and to push an agenda, and get back to the very rigorous, this is a thing that gets results, this is a belief or a thesis or hypothesis that is useful as information should be?
Well, good things are happening. It used to be that New England Journal and JAMA and a host of other politically charged journals with editors that serve terms like a monarch, they would never leave these positions, that they had a grip on what doctors would hear, just like the three corporate media networks had a grip on what everybody would hear. And we've actually been able to bust that up. We now have our own medical journal called the Journal of the Academy of Public Health by Martin Kaldorf, Jay Bhattacharya, and a bunch of us are editors. We've got a Substack called Sensible Medicine. I think we've got about 100,000 subscribers now, mostly doctors, where we will go in there with a deep critical analysis of any new studies. So when the New England Journal says, hey, transgender treatments improved overall mental health scores, we can say, no, that wasn't true. And by the way, you remember 2 people out of 300 die of suicide. It's hard, how do you measure their mental health score in the group average? That was published in the New England Journal. So we're doing a lot now, and the program that we started at Hopkins just recently was to take medical students, graduate students in health sciences, and teach them incredible critical appraisal skills of research methodology. so they can go out there and be objective, and now we got the forums for them to criticize studies appropriately, objectively.
All right, I got.
So I remember, I think Ayn Rand once said, don't try to analyze a folly, just see what the results are, and that'll tell you, what was the motivation to do that thing. So the session here started out with the saying that the authorities, or whoever they are, did not learn from policy errors. They haven't learned their lessons. They may do it again. So what I'm asking, we know what the results are of this whole COVID thing, right? A lot of people got rich, a lot of power was transferred. So my question is, were these really policy errors? Or were these intentional to achieve the result that was achieved? Look where we are right now compared to 2019.
I think these were policy errors. Let me explain. Anthony Fauci says he's a baseball fan, which is just such a loser thing that I'm going to be a man of the people and everything. So let's put Anthony Fauci in Nationals Park. And let's agree on something that's probably not true. In that park, he's the smartest individual among the 40,000 people. Okay, maybe true. But if you combine the 40,000 people's, their collective knowledge in that park relative to Fauci's, they would dwarf him by many, many, many. There aren't enough numbers to show how much smarter they are than he is, which is just an example of what markets are. Why do markets work? Because markets are the collective knowledge of the people. I think if you talk to most politicians and experts, they would have told you in a one-on-one conversation, this is wrong, this is disastrous, hey, I get your point, lockdowns, all this. But when you say crisis, you are subsuming the collective knowledge of the people, the marketplace, in favor of experts. It's not that the Soviet Union didn't have geniuses, of course they did. But geniuses, whether as individual groups, are never as smart as the marketplace. So to me, this is just an example of what happens every time. When politicians decree crisis and we must act, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because you are substituting the marketplace for the very few. Of course this is what happened. The results are inevitable. They happen every time. What frustrates me is we can't seem to convince Republicans who claim they believe in free markets that every time they intervene, and they always do, that this will be the end result.
Do we have anybody over here? No, okay, go ahead.
I don't think they're clever enough for it to be a plandemic. I think they really were as dumb as they appeared, so I don't think it was a plan.
I love the panel. Just a brief word of qualification for fun. I had the great privilege of writing the late Dr. Vladimir Zelenko's book with him, who was a real hero throughout the pandemic. A reverse question for you, in a sense, emphasis here on what government has done and the suppression and the dishonesty and all those things. Since the pandemic, we've had something emerge called the medical freedom movement. And I've been on the ground floor of that a little bit. Haven't liked what I've seen in a great many cases. A lot of folks exploiting the opportunity for profit and otherwise. And I know we love profit here, but it depends on how it's being made. And I'm wondering if you might offer your commentary on what you've seen in the medical freedom movement and be willing, or able, I should say, to share any warnings with people about what they might hear, not from government, but from the non-government sector as a way to sort of take advantage of what was created during the pandemic.
I could take a first cut if you want. I think anytime people are skeptical of authority, that's a good thing. And I think that the backlash that we've seen, and I think there's a parental rights aspect to this that's been very productive, and we've seen school choice take off in a number of places based on the backlash during the pandemic. And I think similarly in terms of medical freedom, we're seeing people question, a lot of policies and institutions that probably need questioning. Now, the challenge is, do they throw out a lot of good things along with it? And do we, do people say, I don't believe in Western medicine anymore and just never go to the doctor and then die of something preventable? And so I do worry, I think it's good to have that corrective, but I do worry that it potentially causes some harm. But, to the point that John was making, I think, you need to let people make those decisions. You need to see what happens. You need to not try to tell everyone to be the same. And so I think it's a positive that we're seeing these movements, even if they have their excesses.
Yeah, I agree. The pendulum tends to swing way out to an extreme sometimes. People tend to be turned off by something. We saw this with childbirth in the United States. You saw this over-medicalization of ordinary life with these extreme measures in a hospital, and then people said, okay, I'm going to have none of it. We're going to deliver at home. And you see these pendulum swings, and I do think sometimes there's a bit of a bandwagon effect. The same crappy odds ratio data on vaccine boosters for babies and Paxlovid for those who had natural immunity was the same poor, sloppy odds ratios to support ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. So it's like everyone, conveniently picked what they chose to believe and not believe in. And the hardest thing for me was to say, in this case, I agree with Dr. Fauci, because I thought he was so difficult, and I wanted to just react when I heard him say something. But people are good to question the medical establishment. We should be treating more diabetes with cooking classes, not just throwing insulin at people. We have the most medicated population in the history of the world. And we heard Abigail Shire last night talk about the conversion of America's children into a generation of patients. And that is a groupthink bandwagon effect that somebody has got to stand up. During the pandemic, we saw all these experts put their head in the sand. Their whole career, life, PhD, was in child development, and they teach it for years at a university. They had nothing to say about kids being shut out of school for 2 years. All these people intellectually dishonest, and we need people to speak up who are not afraid of consequences. Maybe we should be treating more childhood obesity by talking about school lunch programs instead of just throwing Ozempic at kids. Maybe we should treat more back pain with ice and physical therapy instead of surgery and opioids. We've got to change what we're doing. We need to talk about food as medicine, microbiome health, general inflammation. These are giant blind spots in American medicine, so we need people to question the establishment.
Just one other thing on this, and Dr. Makary, and you would know this better than I. In the mid-19th century, if you broke your femur, you had 1 in 3 chances of death. If you broke your hip, you were going to die. If you got cancer, forget about it, you were dead. But see, most people didn't die of cancer because pneumonia and tuberculosis got them well before cancer would get its shot. What changed? Well, Dr. Makary knows. He's at Johns Hopkins Medical School. That was the first medical school of its kind that actually was about trying to cure what killed us. And it was a function of wealth. Johns Hopkins, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, made a $7 million donation that created this. John D. Rockefeller in his lifetime, of the $530 million he gave away in his lifetime, $450 million of it was to medical research. And so by World War I, for the first time in world history, more people were dying actually from gunshots and bombs than typical disease. And so what changed? Wealth creation changed. And with that, suddenly people had the ability to not farm all their life, and they could actually pursue cures, but they also could be matched with wealth necessary to find the answer, the fixes for that which used to so readily kill us. Now remember this in light of what these guys did, Republican and Democrat, in 2020. A virus is spreading, and they quite literally chose economic contraction to mitigate the spread of the virus. Have you ever heard of something more mind-numbingly stupid than this? Historians will marvel at the abject stupidity of the political class that they chose this route. Wealth is the only way to cure diseases and to extend life. The biggest enemy of death and disease is wealth creation. The biggest driver is poverty. We chose poverty. Is it any surprise the results of this disaster?
Well put.
Might do one last quick question right here.
Hi. Well, my ask is because in Guatemala, the mass media ignored private doctors, no? And I would like to know if it was really similar here in America, because I ask because in the media that wrote against this topic or this type of health dictatorialship, all kinds of public resources were used and the people confront the people, no, in Guatemala, and could not find out about any critical analysis, but you cannot resort other information, no? If it's similar here in America, or we have one resource to confront the government for his politicians, no?
So is the question about censorship, that
Yes.
you couldn't find information in Guatemala, that only the government was the source of information? Is that the question?
Yes, because the
Okay.
government censorship a lot think tanks or alternative resource to the people could read, no?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, how different was it here in the United States?
Well, we didn't have express government censorship, but we had an awful lot of soft censorship, the devastating takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration, the extensive efforts after the Biden administration came in to work directly with the social media companies, take down this, and this, the
Alex
you know,
Berenson.
Alex Berenson being, the
Most high
Andy,
profile, yeah.
and Andy, Andy
Slavitt.
Andy Slavitt telling Twitter that they need to block Alex Berenson's account. We had a lot of censorship. It wasn't official policy, but there was a lot of behavior that went on. And to the Supreme Court case that you mentioned earlier, it seems no one has standing to challenge it in the courts, which is why I think we need some legislative action. So look, I think all of the information was out there for people who wanted to find it, but the officially sanctioned information was much more accessible to much more people.
And I also think there's when you censor, you tend to amplify. I'll bring it back to the When Politicians Panic, which all of you should buy lots of copies of, but easily my best source for it was the New York Times. The New York Times led with alarmist headlines, and then when you read into the articles, they actually reported on a lot of interesting things that you couldn't get anywhere else. And so I think there's a tendency on our side to play victim a little. How many of you didn't know? How many of you went through your Twitter and Facebook feed and couldn't find information? Spare me. You could. We all could. It was out there. It was in the newspapers. Some of the best was in the New York Times. I think some of this is victimhood from our side, and I think it's people trying to look for an excuse for why they freaked out at a time when they shouldn't have.
All right, let's give them a huge round of applause. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been wonderful.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like below. And if you really want to help the Atlas Society's mission, then go to atlassociety.org to donate, or donate right here on the YouTube platform.